So without further ado, let's start off this presentation. Next slide, please. So the agenda, as Ingrid just briefly described, is really an overview of different recruitment strategies. And what we will be looking on is, first and foremost, better understand what is the current situation within clinical trial recruitment and what are the available tools in order to achieve this recruitment process. And further down the road, we are going to have a high-level landscape assessment and analysis of what are the different companies and providers that are actually part of this recruitment space. Next slide, please. So here you can see the very core and title of this presentation. From the business team, I would also like to kind of recognize Tom Yanaris, that is also part of the PharmaLedger eRecruitment, along with a lot of other colleagues and members. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect, thank you. So the ability to bring innovative therapies to patients really relies on a robust clinical trial participation. And of course, this begins with awareness of clinical research, coupled with informed decision about the enrollment into clinical trials. And this is why basically the recruitment of subject into the clinical trial possesses not only a substantial element to this process, but also a significant challenge to our space. And as you can see here from the slide, we can see some of the challenges that are being illustrated. So first of all, more or less 80% of trial really fail to meet the enrollment timelines. And the clinical trial recruitment process is not only a quite challenging aspect in terms of time, since 30% of the whole clinical trial conduct is spent on patient recruitment, but also cost-wise, since more than 5.9 billion are actually spent annually during that process. So all these challenges really is the driver that PharmaLedger, wanted to develop a solution that actually address those challenges and those gaps in the market. So what is really at stake due to all these challenges that we have so far? Of course, is the development of the drugs and the products are slowing down. And this means that the patient have a longer waiting to get access to those therapies. And of course, from the cost-benefit perspective, every day is really delays and reduces this return on investment from the sponsor or the CRO perspective. And as we just saw, of course, cost-wise, we do have that the process of prolonging the recruitment really increased the cost in clinical research. Next slide, please. So in the next slide here, what we can see is basically an illustration on how does the clinical trial recruitment model works today. And as you can see here from the top, we can see the clinical studies and the clinical sites with a one direction looking into the potential subject pool. So today's recruitment practices are study-centric. And what does this mean? It is actually that different clinical sites are looking for eligible subjects. And they are responsible of identifying those subjects, of screening them, and eventually and hopefully successfully recruiting them into the studies. Next slide, please. And as this process that we just described in the previous slide is one directional and quite challenging, all the different providers and companies within the field try to integrate full or partially some of the following services, as you can see here on the slide. The first one is the clinical trial advertising and awareness, which in this scope includes the creation and the placement of a patient-facing materials in various media formats. It could be digital, it can be radio, television, and so on, with the goal to create awareness and education on a disease level and availability of these trials. Secondly, they offer patient identification, pre-screening, and referral, which this usually includes the identification and pre-screening of the patient and against subset of clinical trial inclusion and exclusion criteria of the different trials. And finally, and quite important as well, is the patient journey facilitation and support, which basically includes different services to facilitate and improve the patient experience, and can have different forms of support, such as logistical, expense reimbursement, and so on. And the reason why all these different providers and companies are trying to be so inclusive and expand really the services that they are providing is because that the benefits are tremendous. Of course, we want to increase the awareness and public engagement within clinical research and have more open and clear discussion about clinical trials between patient and healthcare providers. And finally, make sure that we provide the adequate toolkit so that both healthcare providers and patient are in a better position to make informed decision about their clinical trial options. Next slide, please. And with that being said, as you can see here, we can see the flow of the process. So how does it usually work? So as a first step, we have the patient identification. Then we continue with the patient pre-screening and matching. And finally, with the patient referral. I don't want to go into very much details into this slide, because it's just to give you an idea, okay, in this study-centric approach, in this one-directional system that currently exists with its own challenges, what is the exact process and how a patient can actually successfully enroll in a trial. Next slide, please. Thank you. So within the market, we can see that there's different and a lot of commercial and non-commercial alternatives that are being assessed. And we can definitely see a quite heterogeneous set of companies that provide all the different services that we just went through. So it could be commercial pharmacy provider, it could be commercial and non-commercial vendors-based solution, patient advocacy groups, marketing and social media campaign, healthcare provide-based solution, or academic medical centers. So all these categories are active within the space of patient identification, matching, and referral services, and really trying to contribute in facilitating and creating an easier way to onboard and successfully retain our patient within clinical trials. Next slide, please. And there are different types of services that those organizations are actually offering, and there are different ways that a patient can be identified or a subject can be identified to be part of a clinical trial. What we have selected here to kind of demonstrate is a slightly different way beside the social media, the advertising, and so on. So as an example of what is out there and what are the different ways to get this patient on board with our trials is the medical and health data aggregation providers. And the medical and health data aggregators are also a diverse set of companies with varying capabilities and business models. So what these companies actually do is that they aggregate data from systems associated with the provision of health services to patients. And basically, this includes medical data, claims data from insurance companies, genomic data, or wearable and device data. And all this information are processed, and they can perhaps provide some insights to the sponsor or the CRO or to the institution that are conducting the clinical trial to better select the eligible subject to the trial. Next slide, please. So finally, I would like to kind of close this presentation around a high-level overview of the recruitment strategies and with the current background analysis that we have performed within PharmaLedger. And basically, through this analysis, we just wanted to understand what are the points, what are some of the points that the PharmaLedger solutions and eRecruitment services can be different from what exists on the market. So this list is not exhaustive. We just put some of the important and key points and key offerings of PharmaLedger solution. And we try to identify any difference across vendors, study registries, and sponsors portal. Some of the characteristic that our platform is offering is a patient-centric trial discovery, the fact that it's sponsor agnostic and that it's neutral, and that it really values the patient privacy. And more details will be outlined in our second session, where we're going to have a really deep dive into what are the offerings of this eRecruitment service and platform. So I'm not going to spend more time in providing more details, but as you can see here, for example, within the second characteristic that we have, a sponsor agnostic characteristic provided by PharmaLedger. Across the vendors, we can see that it's limited and it's usually based on a disease area scope. The study registries, on the other hand, you can see that have this feature and it's available because it can be adopted by all sponsors. And finally, when we're talking about a sponsor portal, of course, as you can understand, it's very limited and also only referring to one sponsor. So I don't want to go, again, as I mentioned, through a lot of details, but what we try to do here as a team is to understand what are the difference of PharmaLedger and other solutions. Thank you very much.